The wheelchair stopped right at the edge of the staircase. For a brief moment, the entire hallway of the mansion fell silent. The housemaid stood behind the wheelchair, her hands resting on the handles. In front of her sat the old woman, the mother of Billionaire, Adewale, a woman who had once been the heart of the family but now sat motionless after suffering a stroke. The old woman slowly turned her head, her voice weak. "Child, where are you taking me?" The maid didn't answer. Her eyes briefly glanced up at the security camera mounted on the ceiling, then shifted back to the long staircase leading down to the grand hall. One breath, one cold moment, and then her hands suddenly released and shoved the wheelchair forward. The wheelchair shot ahead. The metal wheel struck the first step. Clang, then another. Clang, clang. Clang. The wheelchair tumbled down the marble staircase. The sound of metal echoed throughout the mansion. The old woman's faint scream filled the vast space. And then everything went silent. An accident had just happened. At least, that's what the maid believed. But there was one thing she didn't know. Everything in this house was being recorded by cameras, and somewhere else in the city of Lagos, Nigeria, a powerful man was about to see the entire truth. Hello everyone. If you are watching this video, let me know which city or country you are watching from. I'm always curious to see how stories like this are being heard all around the world. The stories on the Final Secret channel are not just family drama. They are powerful lessons about greed, betrayal, and how the truth always finds a way to come to light. Sometimes in life, the people who hurt us the most are not strangers, but the ones living under the same roof. So what really happened inside Billionaire Adewale's mansion that day? Was it truly just an accident? Or a carefully planned act? And when he watches the security footage, what truth will leave the entire house in shock? If you enjoy dramatic and meaningful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next episodes. Now sit back, relax, and listen to the full story with me. Since the day the stroke struck Mama Grace in the middle of her morning prayer, the Adewale mansion seemed to lose the warmth it once held. The woman who had once walked confidently through the stone hallways, who personally cared for every flower pot on the front terrace, who ruled a large family with a gaze that was strict yet full of compassion, now spent her days sitting silently in a wheelchair beside the window, watching sunlight drift across the garden she could no longer walk into. 3 years passed. Her legs never recovered. The wheelchair became her only means of movement, and the luxurious mansion on the quiet hill outside Lagos slowly turned into a gilded cage, a place where she lived surrounded by comfort yet imprisoned inside a body that had betrayed her. Adewale, the most successful son in the family, had done everything money could possibly do. He invited the best doctors. He installed a small elevator in the east wing of the house. He replaced every slippery floor with expensive anti-slip stone. He hired nurses, physical therapists, a private chef, and a full-time caregiver. But after many attempts, no one stayed long. Some complained the work was too demanding. Some could not tolerate the unpredictable temper of a sick elderly woman. Others simply worked carelessly while collecting their salary. Then Esther appeared. A young woman from a distant village arrived carrying an old suitcase, a few worn clothes, and a face so gentle that no one could imagine she could cause any trouble. On her first day in the mansion, Esther barely lifted her head. She spoke softly, walked quietly, and always answered, "Yes, ma'am," or "Yes, sir," with such politeness that people felt she might startle if someone raised their voice. That quiet humility was exactly why Mama Grace agreed to keep her. And slowly, day by day, Esther blended into the life of the mansion like calm water flowing through a familiar path. Every morning, when the mist still hung over the palm trees outside, she would push Mama Grace's wheelchair into the garden, wrap a shawl around her shoulders, adjust the blanket on her knees, and gently ask whether she preferred to sit near the bougainvillea vines or beside the fountain. Every afternoon, she patiently fed her spoon after spoon of porridge, crushed her medicine, wiped her lips, changed her cloth, and massaged the stiff fingers in her hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Every night, when the mansion fell into its quiet, distant luxury, people would hear Esther's voice softly reading prayers in Mama Grace's room. Slow, steady, gentle like midnight rain on a tiled roof. Some days the old woman was in so much pain that she knocked an entire bowl of soup onto the floor. Esther never became angry. She simply bent down, gathered the broken pieces of porcelain, wiped the spilled soup from Mama Grace's dress, and brought another bowl, warm, but not too hot. Once, Mama Grace snapped at her for no reason in front of the entire family. Esther remained silent, accepted the blame, and even apologized for upsetting her. Before long, everyone in the house grew fond of her. The house manager said he had never seen a young girl so patient and hardworking. The chef often saved the best food in the kitchen for her. Even Adewale's sister, a woman known for her difficult personality, once admitted that the girl cared for their mother better than her own children did. At first it sounded like casual praise, but after many months, it became a shared belief throughout the mansion. Esther was no longer the new maid from a distant village. She became Mama Grace's shadow, the person who knew the exact minute she needed her medicine, the passage of prayer she preferred before sleep, when she needed another pillow under her back, and when she pretended she was fine simply to avoid bothering others. The longer Esther stayed, the more she seemed like an irreplaceable part of the old woman's life. And that was exactly what caused everyone, except Adewale, to slowly lose their instinct to doubt. Because Adewale was the kind of man who had built his empire by never trusting appearances. In business, he had encountered too many false smiles and beautiful promises hiding ambition and betrayal beneath them. He did not deny Esther's dedication. He raised her salary, gave her generous bonuses during holidays, and even arranged money to be sent back to her village to repair her father's roof. But in his heart, he never fully lowered his guard. Not because he had any proof. It was simply that he was not used to trusting someone who seemed too perfect. Sometimes, the people who reveal the fewest flaws are the ones hiding the most. One night, close to midnight, Adewale returned from a long business trip. As he passed his mother's room, he glanced through the half-open door and saw Esther asleep in a chair beside the window, her head leaning against the wall, one hand still resting on the wheelchair handle, as if she feared that if she let go for even a moment, Mama Grace might disappear. For most people, that sight would have been enough to soften their hearts. But Adewale, instead of feeling only sympathy, stood quietly studying the girl's sleeping face. It looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Not cold with cruelty, but empty in a way that was difficult to read. It reminded him of people who were exceptionally good at controlling themselves. Another afternoon, he overheard his mother asking Esther in a soft voice, "Do you care for me? Because you truly love me? Or because you're waiting for something?" The question made Esther pause, just one beat. But it was enough for Adewale to remember. Then she smiled again, lowered her head, and gently told the old woman she was thinking too much. At the time, he reminded himself that illness often made the elderly suspicious. He chose logic over instinct. And then the accident happened. That afternoon, the sound of metal striking stone, the echo of the wheelchair crashing down the staircase, and Mama Grace's weak cry tore through the fragile calm of the mansion. When Adewale rushed to the hospital, the doctor examined her briefly and said something that sounded perfectly reasonable. "It looks like she slipped from the wheelchair." The sentence offered everyone in the house an easy escape. The house manager exhaled heavily in relief. The servants bowed their heads sadly, but none of them seemed surprised. Esther stood in the corner of the room, her eyes red, her hands trembling. Exactly like a caregiver who had just witnessed a terrible accident, she was powerless to stop. If it had been anyone else, the story might have ended right there. A slip of the hand, a moment of carelessness. A tragic accident no one could truly blame. But Adewale did not see the scene the way the others did. He looked at his mother lying motionless on the hospital bed, her head wrapped in white bandages, her pale lips trembling, her frail hands shaking as if still trapped in the terror she had just experienced. Then he turned to Esther. She immediately lowered her head, her shoulders shaking as if holding back tears. Too perfect, too precise, too neatly presented. And that perfection sent a cold sensation crawling down his spine. He didn't ask what time his mother had fallen. He didn't ask whether Esther had been hurt. He didn't ask the doctor for more help or more money. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, his eyes dark like a sky before a storm, and asked in a voice so low it made everyone uneasy, "The camera at the staircase, is it still working?" The entire room fell silent. The house manager blinked in confusion. The doctor looked at him as if wondering why. While his mother lay there injured, Adewale was asking about a camera. And Esther, though very slightly, could not hide the way her hands tightened together. It was such a small movement that anyone else might have missed it, but not a man who had spent his life reading truth from the smallest details. In that moment, Adewale no longer felt as if he were standing inside a hospital. It felt like he was standing before the door of a dark secret that had just begun to open. And for the first time since hearing the news, he clearly understood that what had happened inside his home might not have been an accident. Perhaps for the past 2 years, beneath the layers of devotion, gentleness, and loyalty everyone had praised, something else had been quietly growing. A patience not born from kindness, but from someone waiting for the right moment. A gentleness not born from love, but from someone clever enough to avoid suspicion. And when he looked at Esther again, the young village girl everyone trusted more than their own family, Adewale suddenly realized that from this moment forward, everything inside that mansion would change. Because if the camera was still working, then the truth was still alive. And once the truth opened its eyes, no one in that house would be able to hide from it anymore. The steel door of the security room opened with a dry click, a short sound, yet cold enough to make anyone feel as if they had just stepped into a place where human emotions did not belong. The room sat deep in the basement, completely separated from the warm luxury of the mansion above. There were no paintings on the walls, no scent of expensive perfume, no soft music like the kind that drifted through the living room every evening. Here, there was only the pale blue glow of monitors, the low hum of cooling fans, and the dense silence of a place that stored things people usually hoped they would never have to see. 4 large screens covered the wall ahead, displaying footage from all over the mansion. The front gate, the east hallway, the back garden, the garage, the living room, the corridor outside, Mama Grace's room, the main staircase, and the secondary kitchen entrance. Every corner of the elegant house had been cut into square frames, cold, emotionless, as if life inside it had never belonged to people at all, but only to movements that needed to be recorded. Adewale entered first. His face had remained hard as stone since leaving the hospital. He didn't remove his coat. He didn't loosen his tie. He didn't even sit down immediately. Instead, he stood in the middle of the room for several seconds, his eyes scanning the blinking screens as if confirming that everything remained untouched, that no hand had interfered, no piece of footage had been erased. The house manager stood behind him with his hands clasped together, his expression tense. He understood that from this moment forward, the basement room was no longer merely a place for security monitoring. It had become a place where the truth might step out of the shadows. "No one came in here, right?" Adewale asked in a flat, quiet voice. "No, sir," the manager answered immediately. "Since you told me at the hospital, I locked the door." Adewale nodded faintly and pulled a chair toward the control console. The light from the monitors reflected off his face, making his already cold eyes look even sharper, like metal. In Lagos business circles, people often said there were 2 moments when Adewale was most terrifying: when he silently signed a contract, and when he said nothing before deciding to destroy someone. Tonight, in the camera room deep beneath the mansion, he was in the second state. His fingers touched the keyboard, opening the camera archive by time. Rows of numbers, timestamps, and viewing angles appeared across the screen like an electronic diary that could not lie. He selected camera 7, main staircase. The camera was mounted high on the opposite corner of the railing, giving a clear view of the entire corridor leading to the marble staircase, a place where anyone passing would inevitably enter the frame. Behind him, the house manager swallowed nervously. He had worked in this house for more than 10 years. He had seen arguments, tears, departures, and even the moments when Mama Grace collapsed from pain. But never had the atmosphere felt as heavy as it did now, not because of shouting, not because of an explosion of anger, but because of Adewale's terrifying calm. Men like him rarely lost control. They simply became more dangerous when they were completely composed. Adewale pressed play. The video began. The screen showed the wide hallway on the first floor, where afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, reflecting across the polished stone floor. In the distance, Esther appeared. Her hands rested on the wheelchair handles. Mama Grace sat in it, her body leaning slightly to one side as usual, the blanket neatly covering her legs, her head lowered slightly. Everything looked perfectly normal, too normal. Esther pushed the wheelchair slowly and smoothly, exactly like someone who had done the job hundreds of times. There was no hurry, no jerking movement, no sign of losing control. She leaned slightly toward Mama Grace, saying something. The camera had no audio, but her lips moved softly, gently, the same Esther everyone in the house had once praised. Mama Grace did not respond. She simply sat there, her hands resting on the armrests, her gaze forward. The wheelchair continued toward the staircase. Adewale did not move, only his eyes narrowed. Throughout his life, he had read thousands of reports, contracts, and financial charts. He understood how a tiny detail could collapse an entire empire. And now, watching this seemingly simple footage, that same instinct returned. Just as the wheelchair approached the first step, Adewale raised his hand. "Stop," the manager flinched, even though Adewale himself was the one controlling the system. Adewale rewound the footage a few seconds. The image slid backward, Esther and the wheelchair gliding away from the staircase. Then he slowed the playback. "Play it again." This time the video moved slowly enough that every motion carried an unsettling weight. Esther pushing the chair. Mama Grace sitting quietly, sunlight stretching across the floor. A soft breeze moving the curtain at the end of the hallway. Everything normal. Too normal, Adewale frowned. Zoom in on her hands. The manager hurried to adjust the image. The frame enlarged, slightly grainy, but clear enough to show Esther as hands gripping the wheelchair handles. The video continued. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Then the room fell completely silent. Because at the exact moment the wheelchair reached the edge of the staircase, the thing no one wanted to see appeared clearly before them, cold, undeniable, impossible to excuse. Esther had not slipped. She had not stumbled. She had not bent down to pick anything up like she claimed at the hospital. Instead, in the enlarged frame, her arms tightened. Her right hand suddenly pushed forward hard, not an accident. Not a reflex, but a deliberate force, short, controlled, terrifyingly precise. The wheelchair instantly surged forward. The front wheels passed the edge of the step. The entire chair tipped downward toward the staircase. In the remaining seconds of the video, everything happened brutally fast. The wheels bounced, metal struck stone, Mama Grace's body lurched forward, and the blanket over her legs flew into the air like a frightened white bird. But Adewale didn't watch further. He froze the frame at the exact moment before the first drop, when Esther's hands still touched the handle, when the push had just been delivered, when every piece of evidence was trapped inside digital light. Behind him, the manager's lips parted, but no sound came out. His face had turned pale. For months he had praised Esther in front of everyone, told other servants to learn from her devotion, believed that in a world where people changed for money, the young village girl still carried rare kindness. Now a single frozen frame had turned all those words into bitter humiliation. "My God," he whispered. But Adwale said nothing. He stared at the frozen image as if looking into a door that had just opened straight into hell inside his own house. There was no shout, no fist slamming the desk, no explosion of anger. And that silence made the room far more terrifying than any rage. Because the deepest pain often makes no sound. It passes through the body like a cold blade, cutting so deeply that a person loses the ability to react, at least for the first few seconds. Adwale rewound the footage again, then again, each time stopping at the same frame, each time examining Esther's hand more closely. The angle of her body leaning forward, the distance between the wheelchair and the edge of the stairs. There was no room left for doubt, no room left for rational excuses, no room left for the word accident the doctor had casually used at the hospital. This was deliberate, a calculated push, a betrayal carried out in broad daylight inside a house full of cameras by the one person everyone trusted most. Adwale leaned back in his chair and slowly drew in a deep breath. His eyes never left the screen. In his mind, there was not only the question of why Esther had done it. There was another, far more frightening question. If she could wait 2 full years to act once, then what had truly been happening inside this house during those 2 years? How many of her gentle gestures were real? How many nightly prayers were merely a layer of paint covering something darker? How many times had his mother sensed danger, while no one believed her? He remembered Mama Grace months earlier asking Esther softly whether she cared for her out of love or because she was waiting for something. Back then, he believed it was only the suspicion of a sick old woman. Now the frozen frame on the screen struck that assumption like a slap. It wasn't that the elderly imagined too much. Sometimes they saw the truth before everyone else. The problem was that no one had the patience left to believe them. Finally, the house manager found his voice. "Sir, we must call the police immediately." Adwale did not turn. "Not yet." One word, cold as steel. "But sir, the evidence is clear." "I know." His voice remained low and steady. "And because it's clear, I don't want to act too quickly." The manager fell silent. He understood. If Esther truly tried to kill Mama Grace, this push was only the surface. Someone like her could not suddenly become a monster in a single afternoon. There had to be a reason. Money, revenge, someone behind her, or something deeper. Darker, longer hidden beneath the roof of this house. Adwale stood up. The glow of the monitors still illuminated his face, turning him into a statue carved from silence and determination. He saved the video file, locked the system access, and removed the backup hard drive with calm, precise movements that were almost frightening. "From now on," he said quietly, still looking at the screen, "no one must know we've seen this footage." The manager stared in disbelief. Not even Esther? Only then did Adwale turn his head. His eyes were so dark the manager could barely hold his gaze. Especially Esther. Then he looked back at the screen one last time. In the frame, the young woman still wore her familiar gentle expression, her head slightly bowed like a devoted caregiver, standing faithfully behind the wheelchair of the woman who trusted her more than anyone else. If the video had not been slowed down, if it had not been zoomed in, if no one had bothered to look carefully, no one would ever realize that beneath that gentle appearance were the hands that had delivered a push capable of ending a helpless old woman's life. And in that moment, beneath the cold glow of the security monitors, Adwale understood something that money, power, and business experience could never make less painful. The most dangerous people rarely enter a home with loud footsteps. They arrive with obedience, they stay with trust, and they strike when everyone has forgotten how to doubt. The basement room fell silent again. Only the frozen frame remained on camera 7, the frame of a push, a truth, and the beginning of a nightmare from which no one inside the Adwale mansion would walk away unchanged. In the security room buried deep beneath the basement, The air felt so dense it was as if even the concrete walls were holding their breath. The cold light from the 4 large monitors fell across Adewale's face, carving sharp bands of light and shadow over cheeks that had gone rigid with tension. The house manager stood behind him, his hands clasped so tightly they had turned pale, while the soft hum of the ceiling fan suddenly seemed small and distant, swallowed whole by the terrible silence filling the room. On screen 7, the video remained frozen at the moment, just before the fall. Esther stood behind the wheelchair. Mama Grace sat still, small and fragile beneath the pale blanket draped over her legs. The hallway glowed softly in the late afternoon sun. Everything looked normal, cruelly normal. Adewale did not blink. "Keep playing," he said. His voice was low and dry, no longer carrying the tone of a son who had just seen his mother lying motionless in a hospital bed. It was the voice of a man forcing himself to swallow every shred of pain so he could look directly at the truth, even if that truth was about to tear his heart apart. The manager obeyed. The footage resumed. Esther stood behind the wheelchair, both hands resting on the handles as always, just as she had done hundreds of times over the past 2 years in this house. There was no rush, no sign of panic. She pushed the chair toward the staircase with the familiar slow rhythm of a devoted caregiver. The only difference now was that, knowing the outcome, every second carried an indescribable horror, like watching a tiny crack crawl across a sheet of glass while knowing that in only a few moments, the entire pane would shatter. The wheelchair moved closer to the edge of the stairs. Adewale leaned forward slightly. He could feel his heart pounding heavily against his ribs, each beat like a hammer striking iron. Then the moment came, clear, cold, impossible to deny. Esther's hand slowly lifted away from the wheelchair handle. Not a clumsy slip. Not the startled reflex of a careless person. Not a sudden motion from dropping something, as she had claimed. It was a deliberate release. Slow to the point of cruelty. Calm to the point of terror. As if she had thought about this moment for a very long time, had pictured exactly how it needed to happen, where her hand had to be when she had to let go, so that everything would look as much like an accident as possible. In the next instant, the wheelchair lost its support and rolled forward. The front wheels crossed the edge of the first step. The whole frame lurched violently. And then an empty, horrifying sound seemed to ring out in the minds of the men watching the screen. Even though the camera had no audio, metal striking marble. That first impact tore through the silence. The wheels slammed against the stair. The body of the chair bounced upward. The blanket covering Mama Grace's legs flew off like a white bird ripped loose in a violent wind. And then, the entire wheelchair plunged downward. Step by step, each metallic crash. Each time the chair bounced and slammed again. Each brutal, chaotic movement beyond saving. On the screen, Mama Grace's frail body was thrown sideways. Her arms struck the railing, her head pitched forward, then snapped back as the wheelchair rolled over another step. The polished marble hallway and staircase of the multi-million-dollar mansion had, in an instant, turned into a cold machine of torture. Adewale could hear his own breathing grow heavier. Each impact on the screen felt as if it were not striking metal at all, but smashing directly into his bones. He had seen business deals collapse, watched people betray one another for money, witnessed ruin that shed no blood, yet was as merciless as war. But never in his life had he seen something that made the blood in his body turn cold so quickly. Because what was tumbling down those stairs was not just a wheelchair. It was his mother, the woman who gave birth to him. The woman who had carried him across muddy roads during the poverty of his childhood. The woman who had gone hungry so he could go to school. The woman who had prayed for him through every stage of his rise. And now, inside the very house he had built so she could live safely in her final years, she had been thrown down a staircase like an object with no life in it. The video stopped at the foot of the stairs. The wheelchair lay overturned to one side. One wheel was still turning slightly, as if it had not yet understood what had happened. Mama Grace lay motionless on the marble floor. Her head was tilted to one side. One arm was twisted beneath her body. The blanket lay several steps above her, thin and useless, like trust torn to pieces. The manager raised a hand over his mouth. He turned away for a second, unable to bear the sight. But Adwale did not look away. He kept staring. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, but dry, because what made his blood freeze was not only the fall. It was what happened afterward. Esther did not rush downstairs immediately. She stood there, at the top of the staircase, still, looking down. There was no frantic scramble forward. No look of horror on the face of someone who had just caused a terrible accident. No natural human reflex at the sight of a helpless elderly woman lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs. She simply stood there, silent, watching, from the camera angle. Her figure looked slender, her dark dress wrapped around a body so small she almost seemed fragile. But it was that stillness that made her terrifying. It turned her into something colder than human. A shadow, a statue, a witness who felt no panic in the face of something that should have driven her mad with fear. "Stop," Adwale said softly. The manager froze the footage at once. On the screen, Esther was suspended in that exact position, a young woman standing at the top of the staircase, staring down at the motionless body of the old woman below. Adwale felt the back of his neck go cold. Zoom in on her face. The image enlarged. The resolution degraded slightly, the edges breaking into digital grain, but it was still clear enough to see Esther's expression in that moment. And that was what made the room feel even colder. There was no panic, no horror, no tears. Her lips were slightly parted, but not from screaming. Her eyes were fixed downward, intent and silent, as if checking on something, as if waiting for something. Was she waiting to see whether Mama Grace would move? Was she waiting to make sure the fall had been hard enough? Was she waiting for someone else's footsteps before stepping into the role of the loyal caretaker? No one in the room dared say those questions out loud, but they formed in both men's minds like a blade slowly peeling back the skin of the truth. Adwale gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles went white. He remembered the mornings Esther had wheeled his mother into the garden beneath the soft sunlight. He remembered the way she gently lowered her head whenever she greeted him. He remembered the nights when her quiet prayers drifted from his mother's room, steady and soft, as though God himself were close by. He even remembered his sister once saying, with emotion, that Esther cared for their mother better than blood relatives did. Now all of those memories returned, but without warmth. They had become shards of broken glass, each reflecting a different face, one no one had been willing to examine too closely. "Sir," the manager said, his voice trembling so badly it almost disappeared. "How long? How long did she stand there like that?" Adwale did not answer at once. He motioned for the footage to continue. The screen moved again. Esther remained there for a few more seconds. Not so brief that it could be dismissed as stunned instinct. Not so long that it would look obvious. Just long enough to make her silence the most terrifying thing in the entire recording. Then, at last, as if suddenly remembering what role she was supposed to play, she rushed down the stairs. But even that rush, now that they had seen the earlier frames, no longer looked like the reflex of compassion. It looked like the next part of a performance. She dropped to her knees beside Mama Grace, shook her, bent close as if calling her name, then lifted her head out of frame, probably to begin screaming for help. Everything was exactly right. So right that it felt false. So right that Adwale understood the most frightening thing was not an outburst of rage. It was patience, patience deep enough that the person carrying out the act still remembered exactly how to perform afterward. He leaned back in his chair, but his whole body remained taut as wire. Inside his mind, old images suddenly connected in a completely different way. His mother's gaze months earlier. The strange question she had once asked Esther. The time she lightly held his hand as if wanting to say something, then stopped. Esther's nearly perfect devotion. Even the way she had never shown resentment or irritation. as if every ordinary human emotion inside her had been folded up and hidden away somewhere very deep. Men like Adewale knew people like that. They were not truly without emotion. They just concealed it too well. And when someone can hide long enough, no one knows what they may be feeding in the dark. The manager stepped back half a pace, sweat gathering on his forehead. My God! If Madame dies, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The ending was already there in front of them. If Mama Grace died, then what they were watching tonight would no longer be a staircase fall. It would be attempted murder, captured second by second on camera. Adewale slowly rose to his feet. The leather chair gave a soft creak in the silence. He stepped closer to the screen and stood face to face with the frozen image of Esther looking down from the top of the stairs. A son standing before the image of the woman who had nearly killed his mother. But instead of shouting or smashing the monitor, he simply stared at her, for a very long time, too long. His eyes no longer held only anger. There was shame there too. Because he, Adewale, the man who prided himself on seeing through people, had let a devil wearing the mask of loyalty live under his roof for 2 years without realizing it. I fed her, paid her, gave her a place to live, he said quietly, almost more to himself than to the manager. I left my mother in her hands. The manager lowered his head, not daring to answer. Because those words carried more than anger. They carried the crushing remorse of a son who understood that all his money and power had still been powerless against the betrayal growing inside his own home. Adewale reached out and touched the screen, his fingers stopping exactly over Esther's face. You stood there, he whispered, looking down at my mother. And you were in no hurry. In the cold silence of the camera room, the words were so soft they almost disappeared. But they left behind a weight that made it hard to breathe. Because sometimes the most terrifying truth is not in the act itself. It is in the moment after, when the person who caused the tragedy feels no panic, no remorse, but simply watches the consequences in silence, as if waiting for fate to finish the rest. Adewale pulled his hand back and turned away from the screen. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that cold, exact sharpness of a blade freshly honed. Save this entire clip separately. Make 2 copies. One goes in my safe. The other is not to be touched by anyone but me. Yes, sir. And from now on, Esther does not leave this mansion. The manager looked up sharply. You want to keep her here? Adewale turned his head, his eyes dark as storm clouds. I want to know what she's waiting for. The words dropped into the room like a stone sinking into black water. Because everything they had just seen on that screen was only the beginning of the nightmare. A released hand. A wheelchair plunging down the stairs. An old woman lying motionless. And a faithful servant standing still, watching from above as if waiting for some signal from the darkness inside herself. But to Adewale, that moment was the most terrifying part of all. Not the fall, not the blood, not the imagined sound of metal striking marble, but Esther's calm afterward. That calm told him this was not random. And if it was not random, then behind it, there had to be something else hiding in the dark, something deeper, blacker, and far more dangerous than anything the camera had captured. Adewale sprang to his feet so fast that the leather chair behind him flew backward and crashed onto the tiled floor, the sound sharp and heavy like the opening gunshot of a storm about to break over the mansion. In the cold camera room beneath the basement, that impact ricocheted off the concrete walls and came back harder, making the house manager flinch and step back at once. Ever since they started watching the footage, Adewale had been terrifyingly silent, and that silence had made anyone standing near him feel as though they were beside an explosive that had not yet been lit. But now, with the chair hitting the floor, the manager understood the fire had finally caught. Adewale did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the frozen frame on screen 7, where Esther stood behind Mama Grace's wheelchair, her hand just released from the handle. A small, silent frame with no sound at all. Yet it was enough to collapse every bit of trust that had been built under this roof over the last 2 years. His jaw tightened so hard the muscles stood out. In his right hand, he still gripped the backup drive. His left hand hung at his side, but the fingers were curled inward, restraining a tremor of rage. When he finally spoke, each word came through clenched teeth. "Bring her down here, now." The manager did not need to hear it twice. He turned and hurried toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had served this family for more than 10 years. He had seen Adewale destroy a multi-million-dollar deal with a single signature. He had seen him have a disloyal business partner thrown out of a meeting in front of dozens of witnesses. He had seen him become so cold that other men trembled in his presence. But he had never seen this light in his employer's eyes. This was not just anger. This was the anger of a son who had just watched his mother being pushed down the stairs, inside the very house he had built to protect her. As he went upstairs toward the living room, the manager suddenly noticed that the entire mansion had fallen into a strange kind of silence. The staff must have heard fragments of something from the hospital, but none of them knew the truth yet. The great chandelier in the main hall still gave off its soft golden glow, elegant as always. The African paintings on the walls remained still in their dark wooden frames. The antique ceramic vases still reflected the light as if nothing had shattered in this house. But he knew that from tonight on, this place would never be the same again. 5 minutes later, Esther stepped into the living room. She walked slowly, both hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach, her eyes red, her lashes wet, her face pale like someone who had just endured a terrible shock. The dress she had quickly changed into at the hospital had been smoothed back into place, but the sleeves were still wrinkled as if she had carefully preserved just enough disorder to look like a caregiver truly shaken by tragedy. She looked up and glanced around the large room. When she saw Adewale standing beside the coffee table in the center of the living room, and the manager standing farther back with a tight face, she hesitated. Something in the air made the tears on her cheeks suddenly meaningless. This was no longer the atmosphere of a grieving family after an accident. This was the atmosphere before judgment. "Sir," she began, her voice expertly caught with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened." She never finished. Adewale threw the tablet onto the glass table in front of her. Not set it down, threw it. The thin device struck the glass with a hard, icy crack, then slid a short distance before stopping, its screen still lit. On it, the video was frozen at the exact moment Esther's hand let go of the wheelchair handle. That single frame lay before her like a blade stripping away every excuse before it could take shape. Esther went still. No one spoke. The room turned grave silent. No more trembling apologies. No more fake sobbing. No more performance of the loyal, devoted housemaid. Only a young woman standing before undeniable evidence, her eyes wide as she stared at the screen as though she were watching her own soul laid bare under a brutal light. Adewale did not shout. That was what made him frightening. He stood upright, his whole body forged from control and fury. Then he spoke slowly, one word at a time, as if he wanted every syllable to drive itself into her skull. "In this house, there is only one person who didn't know every corner was under camera surveillance." He paused for a beat. His eyes never left Esther's face. "That person was you." The words fell into the elegant living room like a sentence. Esther blinked again and again. All color drained from her face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Adewale stepped forward once. Only once. But it was enough to make her instinctively take half a step back. "You cried at the hospital," he said, his voice calm in a way that was chilling. "You said you bent down to pick up a blanket. You said the wheelchair slipped from your hands. You looked at me like I was a grieving employer dealing with a terrible accident." He pointed at the tablet. "But this is not an accident." Esther finally found her voice. "Sir, no, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Adewale cut in. "Explain it." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the house manager, searching for a way out, a drop of mercy, someone who might still believe her. But the manager only stood there with his head lowered. From the moment he saw the footage, he knew every kind word he had once spoken about Esther was now ash. I just... Esther stammered. I lost my balance. My hand hurt. I didn't mean to. Adewale let out a short laugh, dry and cold, with no trace of amusement in it. Lost your balance? He touched the screen, rewound a few seconds, and hit play. There she was again, clearly, slowly releasing the wheelchair. No stumble. No slip. No natural panic of someone losing control. He froze it again. This is your idea of losing your balance? Esther bit her lip so hard it split. This time the tears did not fall in that controlled, performative way. They came faster, Messier, carrying the smell of real fear. Sir, please, let me explain. Explain? Adewale repeated, his voice dropping lower. My mother lay motionless at the bottom of the stairs. And you stood there looking down at her. He took another step. You didn't run to her right away. Esther trembled. I was in shock. No, Adewale said immediately, his eyes darkening. When people are in shock, they rush forward. When they are afraid, they scream. When they panic, they forget themselves. But you... He tilted his head, looking at her like a filthy riddle that had finally been solved. You stood there, looking down, as if you were waiting to see whether she would move. That sentence struck something inside Esther. She jerked violently, as though someone had slapped her across the face. For one brief instant, Adewale saw pure terror flash through her eyes. Not the terror of someone falsely accused. The terror of someone who had just been seen through. It was the first moment Esther's mask truly cracked. The room remained silent. Outside, the night wind moved through the palm trees in the garden, brushing softly against the large glass windows of the living room. The air conditioning hummed. The chandelier still blazed overhead. Everything in the mansion still carried its beauty, its wealth, its order, its polished courtesy. But at the center of it, a confrontation was taking place that no money could cover. Adewale bent down, picked up the tablet, and placed it back on the table with a movement that was slow and exact. Then he looked at Esther for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was not loud, but it landed with the weight of stone. I paid you to care for my mother. I know, she sobbed. I gave you shelter, food, respect. I know. I placed my mother in your hands. This time Esther could not answer. Her throat tightened. Her shoulders shook violently. Adewale lowered his voice until it was almost a whisper, but that softness only made it more terrifying. Do you know what hurts the most, Esther? He did not wait for an answer. It's not the fall. He rested one hand on the back of the sofa and leaned slightly toward her. It's that for 2 years. My mother trusted you. Those words twisted Esther's face. She lifted a hand over her mouth as if trying to stop the sob that broke out of her. But Adewale did not stop. Every morning you wheeled her into the garden. Every night you prayed with her. Everyone in this house believed you were loyal. He looked straight into her eyes. And you chose the exact moment when she could not stand on her own. To let go. Esther's lips shook uncontrollably. I didn't want. It wasn't supposed to. Stop lying. This time Adewale raised his voice slightly. Not quite a shout, but enough to make the air in the room vibrate. Don't insult my mother a second time with lies. The manager shivered. He had never heard Adewale speak to anyone like that inside his own home. It was not the voice of an employer. It was the voice of a man restraining the urge to crush the person standing in front of him. Esther staggered back another step, then collapsed onto her knees on the rug. Sir, please. She cried for real this time, the sobs ragged and uncontrolled. Please, please, please what? Adewale asked. Forgive you. He lowered his gaze to her. Did you forgive my mother? Esther clutched at her chest, gasping. She no longer held on to that familiar gentle calm. Her whole self seemed to be falling away from the mask she had worn too long. I didn't mean, she said through sobs. I just... But even she could not find a story strong enough to patch over the truth burning on the screen. Because there are moments when a lie is torn open so completely that a person no longer knows what role they are supposed to keep playing. Adewale straightened. He looked down at the woman kneeling before him without a trace of softness. In his eyes, Esther was no longer the young girl from the village, no longer the obedient caregiver, no longer the image the whole mansion had once praised. She was only the one who had sent his mother crashing down the staircase with her own hands. "I'm going to ask you once," he said, "and you will answer me truthfully." Esther looked up, her face soaked with tears. "Why? Just one word." But the whole room seemed to tighten around it. That was the black center of the night. Not what Esther had done. The camera had already answered that. But why she had done it? For money? For hatred? Because someone sent her? Or for something even darker that no one had been willing to see for the past 2 years? Esther opened her mouth, but did not speak immediately. Her eyes moved sharply, as if weighing confession against another lie. That hesitation only made Adewale's anger rise higher. He turned away and took several steps, clenching and unclenching his fists. He knew that if he touched her right now, he might do something that would disgust even himself. He stopped by the large window and looked out into the dark garden beyond, the same place where Esther had wheeled Mama Grace into the sun every morning. Now that image had become an insult. Adewale turned back. His face was no longer red with anger. It had gone white and cold, hard as granite. Anyone who knew him would understand that this was the most dangerous moment. Because when fire turns into coldness, it means he has begun to decide. "You are not leaving this mansion tonight," he said, "until I know the whole truth." Esther froze. "Sir." "Manager." "Yes, sir." "Lock every gate. Disable remote access to every door. No one lets her out. No phone calls. She doesn't touch a single device in this house." The manager bowed his head at once. "Yes, sir." Esther pushed herself halfway up in panic. "No, please, sir, don't." Adewale turned and looked at her. Just one look was enough to freeze her in place. "You should pray, Esther." His voice was low and sharp. "Not for me to believe you." He pointed upward, toward the floor above, toward the place where his mother now lay in the hospital between life and death. "But for my mother to open her eyes again." The words cut through the room like the final blade. Esther collapsed fully, both hands braced against the rug, her whole body shaking. Tears dropped onto the expensive carpet, leaving small dark marks in the middle of the luxurious room. But no one there felt pity anymore, because on the other side of her pain was an old woman lying motionless, a son who had just watched his mother's fall on a screen, and a truth that had shattered the shell of loyalty this entire house had once believed in. Adewale stood motionless in the center of the living room, back straight, like a judge inside his own house. His anger no longer erupted in shouts or destruction. It had settled into something far more frightening, a cold determination to drag the entire truth out of the dark. And Esther, kneeling on the floor, finally understood that the only thing worse than being caught in a lie was being caught by a man who would never stop when the truth concerned his mother. The police arrived at the mansion when the night had slipped into that coldest, quietest hour, the kind of hour when even the smallest sound turns sharp as broken glass. The patrol car lights swept across the palm trees outside the gate. Red and blue flashes spilled over the white walls of the mansion and bled into the grand foyer like a late declaration that, from this moment on, every layer of disguise inside that house would be stripped away one by one. Esther sat in a chair across the living room, both hands resting on her knees, her face drained of all color. The house manager stood a few steps away. 2 plainclothes officers, along with an older detective whose eyes were steady and cold, listened as Adewale laid out everything that had happened without interruption. He did not say much, only enough. Only what was precise. Only what mattered. Then he placed the tablet on the table, opened the footage from camera 7, and slid it toward the detective. No one in the room spoke as the recording began to play. On the screen, Esther appeared once again in the familiar image of a devoted caregiver. Mama Grace sat in the wheelchair once again, small, frail, trusting. The hallway was still flooded with the gentle light of late afternoon. The marble staircase still gleamed as it always had. And then Esther's hand released the handle. Slowly, deliberately, without the slightest mistake. The wheelchair surged forward, the first impact. The second violent bounce. Mama Grace's elderly body crashed down the stone steps in a brutal sequence of motion that made the room feel colder every time the footage replayed, no matter how often they watched it. When the video froze at the moment Esther stood at the top of the staircase looking down, the detective lifted his head. He did not need to ask whether it was an accident. The footage had already answered that. Only one question remained worth asking. Why? For the first few minutes, Esther stayed silent. Her head was bowed, her lips trembling, as if she were still clinging to the fragile hope that if she said nothing, the truth might somehow remain unfinished. But there are moments in life when silence stops being a shield. It only makes the emptiness more terrifying. When the detective placed the tablet back in front of her, rewound to the exact instant her hand let go, and asked calmly, "Would you like us to watch it again?" Esther finally broke. She burst into tears. Not the carefully arranged crying she had done at the hospital. Not the measured sobs designed to invite sympathy. This was the crying of someone who knew the last door had just shut behind her. Her shoulders shook violently. She covered her face with both hands. The first words that came out were broken, choked, tangled together in panic. Then, little by little, the truth began to emerge like a black snake sliding out from the brush. She had not acted alone. Someone had approached her months earlier, not a stranger, not some shadowy criminal gang, but a relative of the Aidwale family, someone who still appeared at parties, memorial gatherings, and family events where no one ever thought to be on guard. A man who always smiled just enough, spoke with just enough politeness, but had long been waiting for the day Mama Grace would close her eyes forever so the fight over the family fortune could begin. He knew very well that as long as Mama Grace lived, many decisions in the family still remained under the moral shadow of her presence and influence. She could no longer walk, but her voice still carried weight. She knew exactly who was deserving, who was greedy, and who was merely waiting for others to weaken so they could tear off a larger share for themselves. To people like him, her very existence was an obstacle, and he had chosen the filthiest possible way to remove it. Esther confessed that he had approached her with money. At first it was only small gifts, a discreet envelope, casual-sounding questions about her village, her sick father, the old roof that leaked every rainy season, the debts she had never told anyone in the mansion about. He did not pressure her right away. Truly dangerous people rarely reveal themselves through impatience. Instead, he planted an idea in her mind, that life had treated her unfairly, that rich people like the Aidwales would never understand what it meant for the poor to kneel before money, that with just one small accident, she could have enough to change her life, save her family, and escape a lifetime of service. Esther said that at first, she was afraid. She refused. She even thought the man was insane. But then the debts back home kept piling up, her father's condition worsened, and every time she looked around the glittering mansion, every luxury item she had never dared dream of in her entire life, something weak inside her began to crack. Greed does not always arrive like a blazing fire. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, just this once, and everything will be different. The man promised her a large sum of money. Large enough that someone who had lived too long in deprivation could mistake it for the only door leading into a new life. All she had to do was make death look like an accident. No knife, no poison, no obvious trace. Just one release of the hand at exactly the right time. An accident on the stairs. A frail old woman in a wheelchair. A tragic incident everyone would sigh over and then accept. By the time Esther reached this part of her confession, she could barely breathe. She clutched her chest, her eyes bloodshot, each word seeming to drag blood out of her body. The house manager stood frozen against the. He had lived long enough to know money could buy people, But hearing everything from Esther's own mouth still made his skin crawl. Because for 2 years, she had not only cared for Mama Grace, she had studied her habits, learned her schedule, understood when the house was emptiest, and known exactly when the hallway camera would capture everything clearly, while still making it easy to mistake for an accident unless someone slowed the footage down. Her devotion, it turned out, had been 2 things at once: real kindness in certain moments, and a long process of building enough trust to strike one day without arousing suspicion. Adwale listened to all of it without interrupting. He stood beside the dark fireplace, both hands behind his back, his face hard as carved stone. Only someone watching very closely would have noticed the small tightening at his jaw, again and again, as if he were trying to keep both rage and grief from spilling out into something uncontrollable. What hurt him was not only the plot itself, it was the fact that the one behind it was family, a relative, a man who had walked through his front door with a polite smile, bowed respectfully to his mother, and sat at the same holiday table. The most dangerous enemy, it turned out, had not broken through the gate. He had sat inside the family, wearing the same traditional clothes, raising the same glass, speaking the same false words of respect, while quietly placing a price on an old woman's life. That very night, the police sent officers to find the man Esther had named. The news spread quickly through the family, but no one dared speak too loudly. The mansion, once full of elegance and constant movement, suddenly grew as heavy as a church after a funeral. The housemaids walked more softly. The kitchen staff spoke in lower voices. No one looked at one another the same way anymore. Because when a household discovers it has been feeding betrayal at its own table, every sound becomes covered in a thin but freezing layer of suspicion. A few days later, when Mama Grace woke up in the hospital, Lagos had just been washed by a short rain. Drops of water still clung to the window, stretching into bright trails under the late sunlight. The smell of antiseptic was still strong in the room, but this time it was joined by the steady breathing of someone who had pulled herself back from the edge. Adwale sat beside her bed, no longer the Iron Man from that terrible night. Before his mother, he was only a son again. He took her frail hand in his, the same hand that had once stroked his hair when he was little, the same hand that had led him through the poorest years of his life. Now it was so weak that it felt as though even the slightest pressure might hurt it. He bent his head, his voice low and rough from too many sleepless nights. "I'm sorry. I trusted the wrong person." Mama Grace lay still for a few seconds. Then, very slowly, the corner of her mouth moved into a faint smile. Not the smile of someone who had won. Not the smile of blame. Just the thin smile of a mother who had suffered enough to understand that people do not fall only because of sickness. Sometimes they fall because they placed their trust in the wrong hands. She tried to squeeze his hand. The force was so faint it was almost nothing, but Adwale felt it. And that alone was enough to make the bridge of his nose burn for the first time after everything. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside the hospital room, a mother had survived. A son bowed his head beside her. And back at the mansion on the quiet hill, the camera footage remained in police custody, a witness that was cold, absolute, and incorruptible. It did not know pity. It could not be bribed. It did not grow tired or forget. Inside that house, people could lie. They could fake tears. They could play the role of loyalty for 2 full years. They could wear the face of family while secretly selling out their own blood for property and inheritance. But the camera never lied. It had seen the hand let go. It had seen the wheelchair plunge down the stairs. It had seen Esther standing still at the top of the staircase, as if waiting for fate to finish the rest. And in the end, that silent truth, the truth that could not speak, had spoken for everyone. The story inside Billionaire Adwale's mansion would be remembered as a family tragedy, a money-driven conspiracy, a painful lesson in greed. But deeper than all of that, it left behind one truth that no one who walked away from it shattered could ever forget. In life, what destroys people is not always the shove from behind. Sometimes it is the moment we open the door and let the wrong person into our hearts, trust the wrong gentle face, and fail to realize that beneath that softness, darkness has been waiting all along.